Hello, hello, and welcome back to Bad Teacher Podcast, episode number 2. Happy you've joined me. So we're gonna get to it. Today is the a brief history of capitalism. I'm kind of combining some what a professor says from the Yale University, the series I'm watching. I'll put that in the comments with what a scholar Richard Wolff says on capitalism and Marx theory. Of course, the real OG. That is the center of this conversation and using his work to analyze the education system in the United States. So let's go, baddies. Moving forward, today's a big week. Happy Friday. Happy that we've got the work week finished. We can take a little couple of days off to, enjoy some meditation. I'm currently kind of invested in the Tao Te Ching, journaling with it. And again, whatever we're doing for our well-being is great. Just remember that. So Cinco de Mayo happened a few days ago, Tuesday. I heard it got spicy in my hometown. I don't know about y'all. I wasn't out. But it was also Karl Marx's birthday, which is perfect for the conversation today. Shout out to him. Born in 1818. So what does that make him? Some 200 and some odd years old. Still going strong. His message and his word is still being, the layers are being pulled back and peeled back still to this day. I'm an example of that. And also shout out to the decolonial efforts and the right to resist against imperialism that on Cinco de Mayo, the people from Puebla in Mexico were able to conquer this, raggedy civilian type army, low trained army was able to defeat the French army of 6,000 troops, the French troops. I never foment violence. I'm not for war or anything like that, but you know what I mean? People do ask for it when they want to come on the border, then the shores of this newly independent nation. Mexico had been independent already for 50 years. They were indebted to 3 countries, England, Great Britain, and France. They had been going through the Mexican-American War, which some people call it the American invasion of Mexico. And so after being highly debilitated, Benito Juarez, the president, basically said, no mess, we're not paying our debt. We can't do it. We got to give it back to our people. Euros don't like that. White people don't like that too much. And so I wanted to show you just contextualizing everything, kind of setting up what we do here. I wanted to show you where Puebla was at. I got it pulled up for us. So here's the state of Puebla. Mexico has some 30 some odd states. It is the United States of Mexico. Coming over here from the colonizers into Puebla, they wanted to get to Mexico City. So shout out to them for beating, a small battle, beating the French, the colonizers in a small battle. Unfortunately, they did lose the war, and France occupied Mexico City, and therefore Mexico, it became, part of the French Empire for, I think, 5 to 7 years before the Benito Juarez, the previous president, took back over independence. And they still celebrate the initial Independence Day against that, where they defeated the Spanish crown. More Euro shit. All right. And then something else I kind of like, the PSL posted this. There's Karl Marx, the German communist, if you will, socialist, however you want to call him. And then Nina Simone. I love this. We never talked about men or clothes. It was always Marx, Lenin, and revolution. Real girls talk. Let's go, Nina. Okay, so shout out to this week. Now we're going to go into the real business. What is capitalism? But we're going to take it slow. It's going to be a couple episodes. I want to make this short. I want to make these sweet. I want you to get along with your, relaxing Friday night, whatever you do you. So a little quick history. Most of this is from Robert Wolff, but again, I'm kind of taking pieces from my life as well and everything I've read. So feudalism was the economic and social system of the day, if you will. And what happened was there was this dichotomy, this separation of lords and serfs. All right. Not This isn't a history lesson. This is an economic lesson, right? Kind of like how does economics how do economies transform? So there was increasing crises in the serf class, if you will. As we know, there was no way to become a lord. You were either born into it or you weren't. And so there was this caste system. And if you got in trouble, you were banished, or if you couldn't eat, you died. And so there was an increasing amount of serfs that were disconnected or removed from this feudal relationship, and it was based on God too. So it was a spiritual relationship as well. It was the duty of you to obey this monarch who was in the body form of your God. And these disenfranchised serfs were meeting up with these merchants who, a merchant in this time period were people who had the ability to travel far distances, and they would find a product that was relatively cheap in a place that it was indigenous to, and they would move that product to a place where it was more expensive, and they would make their profit. That's more of a self-employed type of a thing that was outside of the feudal system. It was neither a lord or a serf. And as these different disenfranchised serfs starting to increase because of the contradictions of feudalism, the merchants started to basically make a deal, right? They say, I will pay you a certain amount for you to do my bidding and to make profit for me. So, I might be able to go get the product from this place, and you might be able to distribute it among the people who you have relationships with. And that was the first wage labor. Again, this was highly attacked. This took centuries to establish as a global dominant economic system, because the lords don't like it, right? And so they attacked these small city states, if you will, much like socialist nations are attacked today. Ceding power over to something else, a different system, different structure, is something that has always always resisted against, and always been challenged, usually very violently. There's been very few cases where it has not resorted to violence, unfortunately. We're trying to do better. We're trying to learn from this, right? So we can do it peacefully, whatever that looks like, as the main goal. Nonviolence is always the objective. However, sometimes when you stand on business, that becomes difficult. So anyways, increasingly, this became the system, right? Capitalism grew and grew and grew. It became dominant in Europe. And then with the colonization of the Americas, mainly, it boomed. And then after the Civil War in the United States, that was like a fight, again, about the abolishment of slavery, understood. And in fact, it created a third party. It was the first third party win that now is the Republican Party, and it was over the abolition of slavery. So sometimes these forces, these rupture moments, get us there. And so capitalism won over a slave economy, which a slave economy, there is no wage, right? In a capitalist economy, that wage, that exchanging your labor power for a wage, whether that's a salary or hourly wage, is a different economic system. You're selling your labor, your time, your effort, etc. So that's kind of what happened, and it took over, and now it's the dominant economic force, and it's something that we can't escape. Nonetheless, as soon as capitalism is growing and becoming the dominant economic structure, Karl Marx and other scholars are noticing that there are still a lot of contradictions, and the distribution of wealth is one of the major problems. And so socialism has and is been fighting against the capitalist system for, since basically the onset of capitalism. And just like in capitalism, where you have your small little movements that might be quelled or might exist in isolation, or, be more massive in growing and have more power. The point is different economic systems have always lived alongside of each other. And when we talk about this in binaries, it does obscure the nuances. And so while I do like, sometimes it's handy as a like heuristic to talk in binaries and say, in a capitalist system, I am acknowledging that socialism has lived alongside of capitalism and even some remnants of feudalism, right? I mean, we still call a landlord a lord, which a landlord. So think about that, and think about if you think about a caste system versus what we call freedom, which capitalists did think of capitalism as freedom, a free market, right? Free to make money that you don't have to depend on a lord for your sustenance and for everything, completely controlled by them. And so it was freedom, and those movements were very important. And I do still stand by the fact that, a wage labor or abolishing slavery for wage labor is monumental in the history of the world, but we can still do better. And that's the point. And people are doing better. And I want, and how, right? That's the question, especially in this place, in this education system, but also how we're not doing so great and what we can do about it. All right. So just as a little disclaimer for Marx and myself and all the other ones, we've been working hard, y'all, for over 200 years to figure this shit out because it's dense and it's complex. But Karl Marx never did dismantle the capitalist system, as we know. And he tried everything, by any means necessary. Malcolm X, myself, I'm doing a podcast. I'm no type of podcaster. I'm old, y'all. I have to ask advice from the younger generation. Shout out to y'all for all your help. And I hope to get some production going on. If there's any producers out there that want to work to talk about capitalism outside of the market, because we're doing this for free, let me know. But anyways, we don't have a remedy. We don't have a way out. We just have history and we can learn from that. And so that's the point, and have these conversations and how things function, try to put all the pieces together to make a whole picture. But Karl Marx tried to learn, what was it, calculus at the end of his life, trying to figure out how business cycles work or finances work. And so again, we're out here trying, we're out here still trying to use a socialist framework to transform society, to provide, the basic needs for all inequality, or, thinking of open borders and what that could mean too. But however, capitalism is the impetus for everything. It is in the air we breathe. Whether or not we don't have a choice to believe in it. If we don't believe in it, that's fine, but we still have to work to pay for our basic needs. And so psychologically, we can't escape it, and materially, we can't escape it. So while on here, it might sound like I'm talking big sometimes, we can dream, right? We can have hope. And again, we have material anchors to hold us. We have stories, we have histories, and we have people really doing the good work. And so that's kind of what keeps me going. And again, thinking of the nuances that never in any case in history has an economic system been for everything. There's always been change. And then also no one economic system has ever been the sole way of exchange, right? Or means of production, or, of distribution and of organization of a society. Racism hasn't always been a thing. That was a social construct. And these social constructs, as Marx says, can be therefore changed because they were made up by people. And so that's what's most important about what Karl Marx says, is he does center the social. And even though the economic is dominant to the social, we still focus on the social in order to transform and to invert those two, right? To say that the economy should submit to the social. And so again, how does capitalism work? We're going to again, it's very dense. I'm specifically taking this information from Capital, the book, volume 1, chapter 1, and only a few. We're just going to get into a few very superficial words, if you will, definitions of capitalist systems that he uses. And then the next episode, we'll do a few more. So today, we're just going to talk about Capitalism is essentially class struggle because of this division of labor. And so in order to dismantle this system, worker solidarity is necessary. And again, in the history of the world, every time, we'll talk about this later, but every time there is some sort of workers' force, like a workers' union, it has been attacked by both corporations and governments. And there's plenty of history on that, but that's for later. So it is essentially about class struggle. And that is one of the major and most important contradictions of capitalism is the division of labor, right? So I have to work knowing that once I sign this contract, the employer is going to profit off of my labor. So it's an unfair system from the get, because the whole point of capitalism, kind of as I shared before, is the profit of the employer. So every decision that the employer is making is based on this, how to increase surplus value. And usually that is and it always is at direct odds with the worker, with the employer, knowing that they're signing away their life for this person to get rich, to make more profit than them. So their value as a worker is exploited. So exploitation of the worker. And it's through this wage labor that this labor theft happens. So because the wage is set in advance with the contract, that wage doesn't change based off of how much profit. Sometimes you get lucky, right? They can give you a bonus if they're nice, and we love them for it, and we act like that shouldn't be standard. We act like that was a charity moment, but they're never going to break into that profit. So if you get a bonus, the idea is like they made more money than last year still. And so they're still exploiting you as an employer, no matter what. Or capitalism doesn't work because this employer class is competing against each other constantly. And so in order to remain competitive, the profits have to increase in order to grow more, and reach more people. Because you need resources for that, right? You need workers for that. And so that's about the weight. That's labor. And then we're going to talk about commodities next episode, next week. But think of labor as an interesting and unique sort of commodity alongside money. That's the other unique commodity. But labor is unique in that it can't be depleted. So when I consume a banana, it's gone. However, the labor force I have to constantly replenish, or there is no employer to do the dirty work. And so I have to feed you so you can come to work the next day and continue to sell your labor to me, essentially. And so that, and again, it's not always necessarily that same person, but that labor has to be replaced. And so if you think about migration and how, people have got away with coming to the United States and then all of a sudden not, like that has to do with employers saying we need to replace our laborers because in the United States, we don't have enough. And then as soon as, and then we can use them for our own political means to pit, the vulnerable against each other. And so not to get off task, but just thinking about how that, think about that. We need to replenish the labor force. It works differently. And so that's our power at the same time, because then that's how we know that we are needed. And if we stop functioning as laborers, what does that mean for the employer class? Just some things I ruminate about, So anything, just like in the division of labor between the employer and employee, which is the difference of capitalism and feudalism, right? Which is serf and lord, or a slave economy, which is the enslaver and the enslaved. In this case, it's the employer and the employee. But within this division, there are also hierarchies, right? So it's very clear by how much money you make, kind of like the value of you as a human, which is the problem, right? So one person can be worth double than the other person, even though socially and in nature that doesn't exist. This is a capitalist concept, a capitalist mechanism, a capitalist contradiction. So like this idea that you're free, right? That's what they say, but really you're only free to sell your labor or you die. So you have to sell yourself in order to buy what you think what they tell you you need, essentially. And so there's hierarchies within, and then it's also, if you think about we'll talk about this next, but all of these jobs get split up and kind of compartmentalized. And so no one person understands the whole. And we're going to continue to break that down and how that works in education. So moving on to what value is in a capitalist system, there's a lot of ways that he breaks down value, but we're going to focus on two. And that is use value, which is needs and wants. It's what people need and want, so they value it. And it's in that need and want that it is valued. Okay, so if you don't need it or you don't want it, there is no value in that, right? You wouldn't buy it, for example. And again, I'm not trying to conflate value with money, but it's hard sometimes not to. But according to Marx, value is something separate because I can trade two things, right, that have the same amount of exchange value, if you will. So moving on to exchange value, that's different in the sense that happens at the moment of the exchange or of the action. So that was what it was worth in that moment. Okay. And those two in a capitalist system get conflated into just value. So while the narrative is really about surrounded on needs and wants, the contradiction, which Marx uses a lot of, like, let's highlight the contradictions, is that really it's the exchange value that is dominant under the guise of the use value. Again, so that's a harder understanding, but we're going to keep talking about it. So it's basically just saying that the exchange value takes precedent over all under the excuse or under the justification that you actually need this, and this is normal. It's normalized, and it is the way. It just is what it is. This is normal. This is human. And you guys just have to either get it or get with it or get lost type of narrative, rather than saying, we have all these alternatives. Let's consider these. And so this shows up, this kind of distortion kind of shows up a lot of different ways in education system. For now, I want to shout out a couple organizations for you guys, because it's like, okay, I want to end always with the concrete and try to relate it back to the conversation. And so this shows up in, this is what the whole entire podcast is about. So we'll keep talking about how this labor theft and this compartmentalization and hierarchization and the division of everything and the distortion comes into play in the education system. But I want to share my screen again. So I want to shout out this organization doing real good work. If you join the Action Network, somebody will actually contact you, set up a Zoom meeting. It's great. I enjoyed that. And then they kind of put you on with local people who are also organizing and active. I like this because if you don't want to be an organizer like myself, you can still be involved in a meaningful way and getting involved with other local communities at the same time that you're working with this global, glue called AROS, the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools. So check it out. And then also what happened this week on May 7th, they launched a campaign that's called Free the Future. And this is about the massive budget cuts that the One Big Beautiful Bill has enacted. And one of those things is, they're cutting the educational budget by $7.3 million, I believe. Yep, it's billion. That just blows me. $7.3 billion. And they're, it's interesting. If you look, the largest increase is charter schools program. So if you think about capitalism in terms of for-profit, this is an example of how the government and corporations work in tandem in a capitalist system to ensure that the free market is dominant, capitalism is dominant, and privatization, is part of our tax dollar. Like, we're paying for privatization of schools, essentially. And when we're going to talk about charter schools, we're going to talk about vouchers, but let's just establish this first little foundation. And then what's being eliminated are things that, by and large, accommodate and benefit and provide material economic realities and opportunities for and to Black and Brown students. Title III, this is what funds EL programs and emergent bilingual programs. This is what funds Native American language revitalization and maintenance programs. Migrant education supports children that are moving around a lot, trying to get them acclimated to a lot of different environments all the time, which takes resources and time and labor. And then equity assistance have been eliminated, which reminds me of after the Civil War, there was a Reconstruction movement that lasted only 10 years. And that it only lasted 10 years because the federal government removed the troops that were there to ensure that the federal law, the new amendments of the Constitution, like the abolishment of slavery, were being enforced. And when they removed those, that's when Jim Crow and lynching and the removal of all the African American politicians by mostly violent, corrupt, disgusting ways, that's what happened. And so it's very scary to me that the resources to help local schools comply with federal civil rights have been eliminated alongside the Voting Rights Act in the Supreme Court. Again, got a lot to talk about here, right, y'all? And so let's keep thinking. Again, the task for the week is thinking about what you can do to stop the budget cuts currently in our education system. And then how does this division of labor work in the education system? Again, put it in the comments. Let me know what y'all are thinking. How does this show up in your guys' schools, in local districts? And what are some things that you guys are doing on a local level to, mobilize or use your voice to fight against these things that are being imposed on us now and increasing privatization in schools, right? Through our tax dollars. So through a social service that we call public education, and how that is being attacked and what are our feelings about it. Thank you. Keep on listening. We'll see you next Friday. Take care, y'all.